Just after 11 at night. On Christmas Eve, my phone rang. A police officer's voice came through the line. "Sir, your missing daughter came back. She was found near the church. You need to come here immediately." I slowly lowered the phone and looked at the couch across the room. My daughter was still wrapping presents under the tree, humming along to a carol on the radio. My heart froze. If my daughter was sitting right there in front of me, then who had come back to... I appreciate you settling in with me for this one. Before we begin, leave me a quick comment. Have you ever trusted someone for years only to discover they were not who you believed them to be? Yes or no? I would love to hear it. A brief note: some details in this story are fictionalized to deepen the emotional impact. The message behind it is what truly matters. At 11 o'clock on Christmas Eve, the phone on my kitchen counter rang, and a police officer told me they had found my missing daughter near the church. My daughter was sitting 10 feet away from me, wrapping presents by the tree. I am Harlan Prescott, 65 years old, newly retired after 3 decades leading Shepherd's Way Fellowship Church on Bel Air Boulevard in Houston. I retired in September, believing the hardest days of my life were behind me. I was wrong about that completely, and without warning. Grace was cross-legged on the living room floor, sorting through a tangle of red ribbon with her mother's dark eyes and the focus of a woman who takes wrapping paper seriously. Grace Prescott, 34, a second-grade teacher at Westfield Academy. The twin who stayed. The twin who did not vanish from a county fair 27 years ago. "Who's calling this late? Dad?" she asked without looking up. "Wrong number, sweetheart. Go on with what you're doing." If she was right there in my living room, safe and whole and humming "Oh Holy Night," then who was sitting in a police station calling herself by a name I had not spoken aloud in so long? The officer had been matter-of-fact. A woman found disoriented near the church. She identified herself as Lily Prescott. She gave my name, my address, the name of the church. She knew details. He wanted me to come to the Harris County Sheriff's Office to identify her. I set the phone on the counter and stood there with the smell of pine needles and cinnamon still in the kitchen air. I felt the floor shift under me the way it shifts in dreams, where you realize you are standing on something that is not solid. That morning, 16 hours earlier, a lifetime earlier, Garrett Holbrook had come by the house. Holbrook was 56, silver-templed, the kind of estate attorney who shook your hand with exactly the right pressure and remembered your children's birthdays. He had handled every legal matter for my family since the year the twins were born. 27 years of trust, sealed with handshakes and Sunday pewside greetings. He arrived carrying a leather portfolio and shaking December rain off his overcoat. "Routine annual will update," he said. We sat at the kitchen table with coffee while Grace hung ornaments in the living room. I remember the smell of wet wool from his coat drying on the chairback. I remember the way he held his cup with both hands. What I did not remember, not then, not until much later, was the way he watched Grace. "She looks more like her mother every year." "Harlan," he said, his eyes following her across the room. Remarkable resemblance. I should have paid closer attention to the way he studied her that morning. I should have heard what his eyes were saying, even when his mouth was making small talk about estate taxes. But I trusted him. And trust is the most dangerous thing you can give a man who has already decided how he is going to use it. After Holbrook left, Grace sat on the couch and said something I dismissed too quickly. "Dad, this is going to sound strange, but I keep dreaming about a girl who looks exactly like me. She just stands outside the window and watches. She doesn't knock. She doesn't speak." Christmas stress, sweetheart. Everyone dreams a little stranger around the holidays. She nodded and went back to her ornaments. And I went back to my coffee. That is the thing about the moments that matter most. They do not announce themselves. They sit quietly in the middle of an ordinary morning and wait for you to look back at them from the other side of what happens next. Now it was 11 at night and the phone call had rearranged everything. And Grace was taping a silver bow onto a box for her second graders, and she did not know that the world had split open while she worked. I took my coat from the hook by the back door. I found my truck keys in the bowl on the hall table. I did not wake her. I did not tell her where I was going, because I did not yet know what I was driving toward. And I would not put the weight of that name Lily on her shoulders until I understood what it meant. The back door closed behind me with a click that sounded louder than it should have. December air hit my face, sharp and cold. I started the truck and the engine turned over rough in the chill. The last thing I saw before I backed out of the driveway was the Christmas tree lights reflecting in the living room window, and Grace's shadow moving behind them, still wrapping gifts for a morning that was never going to arrive the way she imagined. I pulled onto Bel Air Boulevard with both hands tight on the wheel and the officer's words turning over in my head like a stone I could not set down. Lily Prescott. Someone had dug up a name I buried 27 years ago in a memorial garden behind the church I built my life around, and I was driving through the dark to find out who. The fluorescent lights inside the Harris County Sheriff's Office buzzed like something alive and indifferent, and the woman sitting in the plastic chair beneath them had my daughter's face. Boyd Ramsey met me at the entrance. Boyd was 53, a Harris County detective, built like a man who had earned every crease in his overcoat. He had been a deacon at Shepherd's Way for 11 years before his knees gave out on the church steps, and he switched to attending the early service, where the pews had cushions. He gripped my arm the way men grip things they are trying to hold steady. "She walked up to the church around 9 tonight," he said, keeping his voice low as we moved down the corridor. "Disoriented but coherent. Had documents in a folder. She asked for you by name. Pastor." The waiting area smelled like disinfectant and stale coffee. The woman in the plastic chair looked to be about 34, thin-faced and hollow-eyed, with dark hair that matched Grace's almost exactly and hands that would not stop trembling against the folder in her lap. She looked up when I entered, and I felt something buckle in my chest. Not recognition, not quite, but the shadow of it. The shape of a face I had been mourning since before this woman could have formed a memory. She had a birth certificate. She had a faded photograph of 2 girls in matching dresses. She had details, the church address, the parsonage layout, the name of the elementary school Grace attended. Then she said the thing that stopped my breathing. "Mr. Buttons," she whispered, her voice cracking. "That was his name. I wouldn't let go of him. And then someone pulled me away, and I never saw him again." Let me tell you what it does to a man to hear his dead child's secret spoken by a stranger's mouth. It does not make you believe, but it makes you unable to disbelieve. And that space in between is the most dangerous place a person can stand. Mr. Buttons was a stuffed rabbit with one ear shorter than the other because Grace had chewed it during teething. Lily carried him everywhere. To church, to the grocery store, to the county fair where she vanished. We never released that detail to the press. We never told the police the rabbit's name. It lived in a box in my bedroom closet, wrapped in a pillowcase my wife had embroidered. And it had not been touched by anyone but me in all those years. "Where did you get that name?" I asked. "Who told you about the rabbit?" She looked at me with eyes that were either the most honest I had ever seen, or the most rehearsed. "Nobody told me. I remember holding him, and then he was gone. And then everything was gone." Boyd watched me from the doorway with an expression that said he had already decided this woman was probably not who she claimed to be. But he could not explain the rabbit. I drove home in silence, with my hands shaking on the wheel. The streets were empty the way Houston streets are empty at 1 in the morning on Christmas, not peaceful, just abandoned. Every house sealed behind its own glow of holiday lights. Driving felt like walking through a house where someone had moved all the furniture 2 inches to the left. Everything familiar, nothing right. I woke Grace. I sat her down at the kitchen table and told her what had happened. I told her about the woman, the documents, the face that mirrored hers under institutional light. I told her about Mr. Buttons. Grace listened the way she listens to her second graders when they are telling a story that does not make sense. Patient still, her hands flat on the table. "Dad, Lily's been gone since we were 6, she said. There's a memorial stone behind the church. You planted roses around it yourself." I know what I planted. Grace. I also know what I just saw. She was quiet for a long time. The Christmas tree cast colored shadows across the kitchen floor. The furnace clicked on and filled the silence with its low hum. "The rabbit," she said, quieter now. "Nobody knew about Mr. Buttons except us. Not even Mom told anyone outside the family." I watched her face when she said it. And what I saw there was not outrage. It was not the certainty I expected, the flat refusal of a woman who knows her own history. What I saw was a flicker of something else. Something closer to a question she had never allowed herself to ask. And that flicker frightened me more than anything at the station had. Because it meant the ground was shifting not just under me, but under both of us. And I did not know yet how far down the fault line ran. I had spent 30 years counseling families through their worst moments from behind a pulpit. And not once in all that time had it occurred to me that the worst moment could come for me at my own kitchen table on Christmas morning. Grace went back to bed without finishing her sentence. And I sat alone in the dark, with the tree still glowing in the next room, and a question growing in my chest that I could not pray away. Someone had taught that woman the name of a stuffed rabbit that had been sealed in a box in my closet for nearly 3 decades. There were only 3 people alive who could have told her. One of them had just gone back to bed. One of them was sitting in a sheriff's station. And the third had shaken my hand that very morning over coffee and called it a routine visit. I spent Christmas Day turning that question over like a man turning a key that does not fit any lock he owns. 3 people knew about Mr. Buttons. By the time the sun set on December 25th, I had decided to start with the one who kept records. The day after Christmas, I drove to the Harris County Courthouse and asked a clerk behind bulletproof glass to pull a file that had not been touched in so long. Except it had. Doris Fenton, a heavy-set records clerk in her 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain, disappeared into cold storage and came back carrying a manila folder in an archive box the color of dead leaves. She set it on the counter without comment. I signed the access log and opened the cover. The file smelled like dust and old paper, and the particular stillness of things that have been sealed away long enough to stop belonging to the present. Lily Ann Prescott, missing since July 1997. I knew every page. I had read them so many times in the first 5 years that the paragraphs had worn grooves in my memory. But something was different now. The access log on the inside cover told me what? 3 entries. August 14th, October 2nd, December 4th. All the same signature. Written in blue ink with the controlled penmanship of a man who signs documents for a living. Garrett Holbrook. 20 days before Christmas Eve. 20 days before the woman appeared at my church. He had been inside this file 3 times in 4 months, and he had not mentioned it once. Not during the will update, not over coffee, not in any of the conversations where a man handling your family's legal affairs might reasonably say, "By the way, I pulled your missing daughter's case file last week." A case file is supposed to be a record of what happened. This one read more like a blueprint for what was about to happen. Every page handled and prepared by the same pair of hands, in the margins. In that same blue ink, I found annotations. Updated contact information for the Harris County Medical Examiner. A highlighted clause about the legal presumption of death after 7 years. Notes about identity verification procedures. The kind of notes a man makes when he is building something, not reviewing something. I closed the folder and sat in the courthouse lobby drinking coffee from a vending machine that tasted like the inside of a filing cabinet. I thought about Garrett Holbrook at 29 years old. Fresh out of law school, sitting in my living room while my wife wept and my remaining daughter slept in the next room. and the world outside was still searching for a 6-year-old girl who would never be found. I want you to understand something about trust the way a pastor understands it. When a man has sat across your desk for the decades he had been trusted and you have never once doubted him, the doubt, when it finally comes, does not arrive like a stranger knocking. It arrives like finding a locked door inside your own house that you never knew was there. You stand in front of it, and you realize the door has been there the whole time. And the only thing that changed is that you finally looked. The next morning, I drove to Holbrook's office on Westheimer Road. I told him I had a follow-up question about the will update. He welcomed me the way he always did. Firm handshake, coffee offered before I sat down, the leather chair across from his desk, positioned to make a client feel heard. His office smelled like cologne and old leather. A clock on the wall ticked with the patience of a man who bills by the hour. Traffic sounds from Westheimer were muffled through double-paned glass, and the room had the sealed, temperature-controlled quiet of a place where secrets are kept professionally. "Garrett," I said, "remind me you handled the paperwork back when Lily went missing, didn't you? I've been thinking about those days." He leaned back. "I was barely 29. Your family was my third case. I've always felt a personal connection to it. Harlan. That's why I've stayed on all these years." He said it with warmth. He said it with the steady eye contact of a man who has nothing to hide. And I sat across from him knowing he had been inside my daughter's case file 3 times since summer, and wondering how many years he had been practicing that exact expression. I stood to leave. He walked me to the door, his hand on my shoulder the way it always rested there, guiding, paternal, proprietary. "Oh, one more thing," he said. "The way a man says he will pick up the dry cleaning. There's an identity confirmation procedure scheduled for early January. Standard protocol when a missing person resurfaces. I'll handle the paperwork. You won't need to worry about a thing." An identity confirmation procedure. He said it as though it were a zoning variance or a tax amendment routine. Clerical, forgettable. And that was the most frightening part. How ordinary he made a thing sound that could rewrite my family. I walked out onto Westheimer Road with the December wind cutting through my coat and a single thought forming behind my sternum like ice on still water. He had been inside the file. He had been inside the case. He had been inside my family for nearly 3 decades. And I was only now beginning to understand that he had never been standing beside us. He had been standing behind us, where we could not see what his hands were doing. The drive from Holbrook's office to the sheriff's station took 14 minutes. I spent every one of them thinking about a man who shakes your hand while his other hand is reaching for your wallet, and how the handshake always feels warm because that is the hand he wants you to notice. Boyd Ramsey listened to everything I said without interrupting, and when I finished, he sat back in his chair and rubbed both hands across his face, the way a man does when he already believes you but wishes he did not. His office smelled like stale coffee and old carpet. Case folders were stacked on every surface. He leaned forward with his elbows on the desk and spoke carefully. "Pastor, I believe every word you're telling me. But belief isn't a warrant. He's your family attorney. He has a lawful reason to access that file. I need something a judge can hold in both hands." "Then what can you do?" "Off the record? Quite a lot. But you tell no one I'm looking, not Grace, not your deacons, not your God, until I say so." We shook hands across his cluttered desk. It was the handshake of 2 men entering an agreement that had no paperwork and no safety net. Just a shared suspicion, and the understanding that the man they were both watching had been doing this longer than either of them had been paying attention. There is a particular kind of helplessness that comes from sitting across a desk from a man with a badge who tells you he believes you but cannot act. It is the helplessness of watching a fire through a window you cannot open. You can see the damage, you can feel the heat, but the glass does not care what you know. And it will not break until someone gives you the right instrument. I drove home the long way. Down Bel Air Boulevard past the church, past the memorial garden where the roses I planted for Lily had gone dormant for winter. The garden looked the way it always looked in December. Bare stems, mulched beds, the small stone marker half hidden by fallen leaves. I had tended that garden every Saturday morning for 20 years. And now I wondered whether Holbrook had ever stood there while I was not looking, measuring what it was worth. That evening I went to see Estelle Mercer. Estelle was 68 years old, a retired school librarian with silver hair cut close and dark eyes that catalogued everything they saw. She had played the organ at Shepherd's Way for 31 years, lived in the small brick house next to the church parking lot, and possessed the kind of quiet attention that most people mistake for nosiness until the day they need exactly what she noticed. She opened her front door before I had finished knocking. "I've been waiting for you to come ask me, Harlan," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "I wasn't sure you'd noticed yet, but I knew something was wrong the first night I saw him bring that woman into the church at 10:30 on a Tuesday. Her kitchen smelled like green tea and lemon verbena. She set a cup in front of me and then reached into a drawer beside the sink and pulled out a composition notebook, the black and white marbled kind that schoolchildren use. The kind a librarian would choose because it cannot have pages removed without leaving evidence. Estelle Mercer had been watching for weeks, writing it down in school teacher handwriting with a ballpoint pen. Dates, times, license plate numbers, descriptions of the woman Holbrook brought with him. Nobody had asked her a single question, because nobody had thought to look at the 68-year-old church organist who lived next door and noticed everything. "How long?" Estelle. She opened the notebook to the first page and turned it toward me. The entry was dated in the upper right corner. The way she must have taught 1,000 students to date their assignments. September 14th. The same day, Holbrook sat in my kitchen drinking coffee and telling me my will needed a routine update. The same day he shook my hand at the front door and told me Grace looked more like her mother every year. That morning he had been in my house. That evening, according to Estelle's careful handwriting, he had walked a woman into my church after dark for the first time. I stared at the date and felt something settle in my chest that was heavier than anger and colder than grief. This was not a scheme that had started when the woman appeared at the church on Christmas Eve. It had started in September. 3 months of preparation. 3 months of late-night visits and documents and rehearsals, all happening inside the building where I had preached the gospel for 30 years. 10 yards from Estelle's bedroom window. Methodical. Patient. Planned down to the hour. "There's one more thing," Estelle said. She reached into the notebook and pulled out a loose sheet tucked between the back pages. "I've been saving this because I wasn't sure you were ready to see it." She held the paper against her chest and looked at me with the expression of a woman who has spent a lifetime deciding when students are ready for difficult information. "I'm ready." "Estelle." She set the paper on the table between us, and I looked down at it. And the room changed shape around me the way a room does when the last thing you expected to see is sitting in front of you in plain sight. It was a photograph. Estelle's hidden document was a printout of a photograph she had taken through her kitchen window on one of those late-night visits Holbrook and the woman walking across the church parking lot, his hand on her elbow. Her face turned toward the camera just enough to be recognizable. I thanked Estelle and drove home with the image burning a hole in the passenger seat beside me. Grace was waiting when I walked through the door. She was sitting on the couch with her knees pulled to her chest and the look on her face that I had not seen since she was 6 years old and woke up screaming for a sister who was no longer in the next bed. "Dad, I need to tell you something." She told me about the dreams. Not the vague mention she had made on Christmas Eve morning. The full truth this time, unedited, delivered in the voice of a woman who had been carrying something alone for longer than she should have. The dreams had not started on Christmas Eve. They had started in mid-November, 6 weeks ago. Always the same, a woman who looked exactly like her, standing outside the living room window at night, watching, never speaking, never knocking. "It's not a nightmare, Dad," she said. "That's what scares me. She doesn't do anything threatening. She just stands there like she's waiting for me to let her in. And every night, the window is a little more open. I sat down beside her and kept my voice level the way I had kept it level for 3 decades of hospital visits and funeral consultations. And inside my chest something was tearing along a seam I did not know was there. When did they start? Not Christmas Eve before that. Think carefully. Mid-November, she said after a pause. Around the time I started getting texts from a number I didn't recognize. If you have children, you know this feeling. The moment you realize the danger is not coming toward your family from the outside, but has already been let in through a door you did not know was unlocked. The dreams had not come from Grace's subconscious. They had been planted, seeded by someone who understood that if you tell a woman often enough that her missing twin is watching her, eventually she will start to see it herself. I asked to see the texts. Grace handed me her phone reluctantly, the way you hand someone a letter you are ashamed of having received. The screen glowed blue in the dim living room, and I scrolled through the thread. The messages were short, unsigned, and escalating. The first, from mid-November, simply asked if she ever thought about her twin. The second suggested she deserved to know the truth. The third proposed a private meeting at a location I recognized immediately. The parking lot behind Shepherd's Way Fellowship. The messages built the way a sermon builds when the preacher knows exactly where the congregation needs to arrive before they know it themselves. Who sends a 34-year-old woman anonymous messages about a dead twin sister and then suggests meeting behind a church at night? And what kind of person already knows the answer to a question they are pretending to ask? I didn't go to the meeting, Dad, Grace said. Her hand was on my forearm, gripping hard. I almost did, but something felt wrong. I just didn't know who to tell. You're telling me now. That's what matters. I kept scrolling. The most recent text before Christmas had been sent on December 27th, the day I sat in Holbrook's office and listened to him talk about an identity confirmation procedure, as though he were ordering lunch. The message read, "Your father knows more than he's telling you." Somebody was tracking my movements. Somebody knew the day I visited Holbrook and used that information within hours to drive a wedge between me and my daughter. The texts were not random cruelty. They were precision instruments, calibrated to separate Grace from me before I understood there was something to fight for. I held my daughter's phone in my hand and felt the weight of every message pressing down on my chest. Because whoever had written those words had not just been trying to confuse Grace. They had been trying to make her doubt me to ensure that when the moment came, she would hesitate. And she had almost gone to that meeting. She had almost walked into a dark parking lot behind my own church to meet a stranger who had been whispering through her phone for 6 weeks. I sipped from the chamomile tea she had left on the side table, cold now, bitter with tannin, and I scrolled to the bottom of the thread. There was one more message I'd missed. Sent at 3:17 that morning, while we were both asleep in this house. It contained no words, just a photograph. A little girl in a blue coat, holding a stuffed rabbit at a winter fair. The coat was too big for her. The rabbit had one ear shorter than the other. And standing behind her, one hand resting on her shoulder with the easy possessiveness of a man who believes he is not being watched, was a face I had seen across my own kitchen table less than a week ago. I set the phone face down on the couch cushion and sat very still. Grace watched me and said nothing, because she had already seen the photograph, and she already knew whose hand was on that little girl's shoulder. Neither of us slept that night. The photograph on Grace's phone sat between us like a third person in the room. A little girl in a blue coat, a stuffed rabbit, and a hand on her shoulder that belonged to a man who had poured coffee in my kitchen 48 hours earlier. By morning, I had stopped asking how and started asking what I was going to do about it. I spent the morning of December 30th doing something I had not done in 30 years of ministry. I sat at my desk and planned a deception of my own. I closed the study door and laid out everything I had. The courthouse access log with those 3 signatures, Estelle's composition notebook with the September date, The text messages on Grace's phone, the photograph. Each piece alone was a question. Together they formed an answer I was not yet willing to say aloud. Because saying it would mean accepting that the man who had handled my family's legal affairs for nearly 3 decades had been engineering something behind our backs for at least as long. I opened my old sermon notebook, the one with the cracked leather spine, that I'd been writing in since the 90s, and I wrote a reflection, not a sermon, something shorter, closer to a confession. A shepherd who cannot tell the wolf from the flock has already lost the sheep. I have been that shepherd, but not any longer. I did not know then that what I wrote in those pages would matter later in ways I could not predict. I had spent 30 years preparing sermons the way a carpenter squares a frame, measure twice, cut once, trust the structure to hold. Now I was applying the same discipline to something I never imagined I would need to build. A trap requires the same patience as a pulpit. The difference is who you are trying to reach. Boyd had quietly provided a contact address from the station records for the woman who called herself Lily. I left a message at the number attached to it, not as a father demanding answers, but as a pastor offering to listen. If she was being controlled, a badge would make her run. A collar might make her stay. She agreed to meet me at 2 o'clock at a small cafe on Bissonnette Street. The cafe was narrow and warm, with rain-streaked windows and an espresso machine that hissed like a radiator. I arrived 20 minutes early and sat with a cup of black coffee I did not taste and watched the door. She came in wearing a gray coat and looking over her shoulder before she sat down. Her hands trembled around the coffee cup she ordered but did not drink. Up close, without the fluorescent lights of the sheriff's station, the resemblance to Grace was still striking, but less exact. The jawline slightly narrower, the eyes set a fraction wider. A careful imitation, not a perfect one. She did not call herself Lily. She did not maintain the performance at all. She sat across from me, looking exhausted, in the way a person looks when they have been carrying a role that does not fit and cannot set it down. "I'm not here as a father looking for answers," I said. "I'm here as a pastor. Whatever you're carrying, you can set it down in this room." She was not the enemy. I saw that the moment she sat down and could not meet my eyes, the way a person cannot look at someone they are being forced to hurt. Her fear was not the fear of being caught. It was the fear of a woman trapped inside a machine she did not build and cannot stop. "You don't understand," she said, barely audible over the espresso machine. "If I tell you, he'll know. He always knows." "Who is he?" She flinched. Her eyes went to the door, then back to the table, then to her hands. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "He said if I do this right, I'll be free," she whispered. "That's all I can give you. Please don't follow me." She stood so abruptly the chair scraped against the tile floor, and she walked out without looking back. The cafe door swung shut behind her, and I sat alone with 2 untouched coffees and the faint trace of her perfume fading in the air. She said, "I'll be free," as though freedom were a wage she was earning by pretending to be my dead daughter. And the sound of those 3 words in that quiet cafe was the loneliest thing I had heard since the night Lily disappeared. I sat there for a long time. The rain picked up against the window. The barista wiped down the counter and did not ask if I needed anything, which appreciated. Then I noticed the napkin. It was on her side of the table, folded once, half hidden under the saucer of the coffee she had not touched. I picked it up and felt the weight of something written on its pencil. Faint, pressed lightly, as though the hand that wrote it was afraid of being heard. I held it to the window light and read 2 words. Not a message, a name. Not Holbrook, someone else entirely. A company name I did not recognize, but that felt like it had been placed in my hands deliberately, the way a prisoner passes a note through the bars when the guard turns away. Creedmoor Holdings. I drove home from the cafe with the napkin in my coat pocket and the name Creedmoor Holdings turning over in my mind the way a pebble turns in a current. Small. Hard. Going nowhere until someone picks it up and looks at what is underneath. Boyd called me at 7 the next morning and said 2 words. Come now. I was at his desk by 7:30. He had printouts spread across the surface, highlighted in yellow. Each one a wire transfer record. 3 transactions over the past 4 months. 12,000, 18,500, 14,200. Each one routed through a trust entity registered in Harris County 8 months ago. The name on that napkin isn't a person. Pastor, Boyd said, tapping the top sheet. It's a shell company. Creedmoor Holdings, LLC, registered last April. And guess whose bar number is on the incorporation filing? I did not need to guess. How much has moved through it? $44,700. 3 transfers since September, all originating from accounts tied to Shepherd's Way Fellowship. The Parish Discretionary Fund. $250,000 set aside over decades of tithes and bequests, managed by the church board. Administered through an account that required 2 signatures, mine and the church attorney's. I had signed dozens of disbursement forms over the years without a second thought, because the man co-signing them had been my trusted counsel since before the fund existed. $44,000. Not enough to retire on. Not enough to make headlines. But exactly enough to test whether anyone was watching the way a thief tries the back door handle before he comes through the front. If no one noticed 44,000, then 250,000 was next. And after that, the life insurance policy. The $800,000 that would become payable to Lily's heir if her identity were legally confirmed at the January hearing. Boyd leaned back in his chair. The precinct coffee was sour and overbrewed, and the printer behind him was still humming out pages. This preliminary, I can't take it to a judge yet. But we're building, Harlan. Brick by brick. I thanked him and drove to Westheimer Road. That afternoon, I sat in Holbrook's leather chair for the second time that week. This time under the pretense of asking about logistics for the identity hearing he had mentioned. His office smelled the same cologne and polished wood and the quiet confidence of a room where expensive decisions are made by the hour. The desk clock ticked the way it always ticked, patient and precise. Sitting across from Garrett Holbrook was like playing chess with a man who had memorized your opening moves so long ago. Every question I asked, he had already prepared an answer for. His voice was warm. His eye contact was steady. His hands rested on the desk with the practiced ease of a man who has nothing to conceal. I steered the conversation toward the old case. I did it carefully, the way you steer a boat through water you cannot see the bottom of. I've been trying to remember, I said, keeping my voice the same pastoral register I used for difficult hospital visits. The fair where Lily went missing that was at Herman Park, wasn't it? It was not Herman Park. It had never been Herman Park. The official police report listed the Fort Bend County Fair. But Herman Park was the location that had appeared in the one newspaper article published at the time, the wrong detail that no one had ever corrected in print. Holbrook did not hesitate. No, it was the carnival at Bear Creek, the west parking lot. I remember because the police report had the entrance wrong. Bear Creek, not Herman Park, which was the public error. Not the Fort Bend County Fair, which was the official record. Bear Creek, the actual location. The real parking lot. The place where a 6-year-old girl in a blue coat walked away from her father and was never seen again. A detail that lived only in the memories of people who had been there. He knew the parking lot. Not the park. Not the neighborhood. But the specific lot where my daughter disappeared. And he said it the way a man says his own address from memory that lives in the body, not in a file. Of course, I said. Bear Creek. My memory isn't what it was. He smiled. I smiled. The clock ticked 3 times in the silence between us. And in that silence, the entire shape of our relationship shifted on its axis. the way a building shifts when the ground beneath it moves. And nothing looks different yet, but the structure will never be sound again. I stood to leave. He walked me to the door. His handshake was firm and measured, held one beat too long, the grip of a man checking whether the person on the other end is pulling away. As I turned to go, I saw it. The shift in his face, barely a second, the narrowing of the eyes, the brief tightening at the jaw. The look of a man recalculating the weight on the other side of the scale. He knew I had heard what he said about Bear Creek. And I knew he knew. The game between us had changed in that handshake, and neither of us was pretending anymore. We were just choosing not to say it out loud. I drove home on New Year's Eve with distant fireworks popping against the Houston sky, and the taste of words I could not yet speak sitting dry and metallic on my tongue. The game had changed, but Holbrook did not know how much I had already seen. That was the one advantage I carried out of his office on New Year's Eve. The knowledge that his mask had slipped, and the certainty that he would now move faster because of it. Estelle was standing at the side entrance of Shepherd's Way when I arrived on New Year's morning, and the way she held the door told me she had been waiting since before the sun came up. "Last night," she said, pulling me inside. The church smelled like cold stone and old hymnals. The scent of a building that has been closed up for a holiday and is holding its breath. He came at 10:15. I watched from my kitchen window. He unlocked the records room and brought that woman inside. They were in there 41 minutes. Harlan. I timed it. He came out carrying a folder that was thicker than the one he went in with. The records room. A windowless closet behind the parish office, where we kept the documents that make a church a church. Baptismal certificates, marriage registrations, old birth records. Membership files going back to the founding. Only 3 people had keys. I was one, the parish secretary was another, and the third was the family attorney I had entrusted with a copy years ago because it seemed practical and because I trusted him, the way I trusted the foundation under the building itself. "The baptismal records," I said. "Grace and Lily were both baptized here. The original certificates are in that room." "Whatever he's building," Estelle said, pressing her composition notebook into my hands, with both entries circled. "He's building it with your church's own paper. And he's using a key you gave him. How do you explain to a congregation that the man they trusted with the keys to their records room used those keys to forge the instruments of their pastor's destruction? And that the pastor is the one who handed him those keys in the first place? You do not explain it, you fix it. And you do not sleep until it is fixed." I spent the rest of that day and the next making phone calls, reviewing what Boyd had provided, and trying to stay ahead of a man who had been planning this since September, while I had been planning it since Christmas. The math was not in my favor. Then Grace came home. It was the afternoon of January 2nd. She walked through the front door from Westfield Academy with her coat still on and her bag still over her shoulder and her face the color of ash. I knew something had happened before she spoke. The way you know weather is coming before the wind changes something and the pressure of the room shifted when she entered it. She sat down at the kitchen table and put both hands flat on the surface and stared at them. "He was at the school. Dad!" My blood went cold. "Who was at the school?" "Mr. Holbrook. He was in the parking lot after dismissal. He said he was in the neighborhood. He asked how I was doing. And then he said something." "What exactly did he say to you, Grace?" "Every word." She repeated it in the flat voice of a woman who had been rehearsing the sentences in her car for the entire drive home. He had told her there was a legal distinction between biological identity and documented identity. He said sometimes the paperwork tells a different story than the blood. He told her that under a particular probate clause, the legally presumed heir could be reassigned if the original daughter's identity were contested. I have counseled widows and orphans and men facing prison and women leaving marriages. In 30 years of that work, I have never felt the kind of rage that moved through me when my daughter sat at my kitchen table and asked the question he had put inside her. Because that question did not come from Grace. It was placed in her mouth by a man who knew exactly what it would do to both of us. "Dad," she said, and her voice cracked on the word the way a branch cracks when the weight on it finally exceeds what it was grown to hold. "Am I really your daughter?" Because he made it sound like that's something a judge gets to decide. Not you. The coffee on the counter had gone cold. The furnace clicked on in the silence after her question, and filled the kitchen with a low, mechanical hum that sounded like the house itself was trying to say something. If you are a parent, you know the difference between the fears your children carry on their own and the fears someone else puts inside them. The first kind you can comfort. The second kind is unforgivable. I pulled Grace into my arms and held her the way I had held her when she was 6 years old, and the world had broken open for the first time. Her shoulders shook against my chest. A tear ran down my face and caught at the corner of my mouth, and it tasted like salt and fury and the end of patience. Over the top of her head, I looked through the kitchen window into the dark January yard, and I made a decision that settled into my bones like concrete setting. I was done being careful. I was done waiting for evidence and process and warrants. Tomorrow I was going to build something Garrett Holbrook would never see coming. And I was going to build it with every person he had underestimated. The first thing I built was the simplest. I sat with my daughter on the kitchen floor and told her who she was. Grace was sitting with her back against the cabinet when I came downstairs that evening. Not crying anymore. Just sitting with Mr. Buttons in her lap. The stuffed rabbit with the chewed ear that had been hers since the day she was born. She looked the way she used to look when she was 5 years old, and the world felt too large to stand up in. I lowered myself down beside her. The tile was cold through my trousers. The refrigerator hummed in the silence between us. "I want to tell you about the night you were born," I said. She looked at me. I could see the question from the day before still sitting behind her eyes, the one Holbrook had placed there like a splinter. September 14th, 1991. Methodist Hospital. Your mother was in labor for 11 hours. And at 9:47 that night, a thunderstorm knocked out the power to the entire East Wing. 11 minutes of darkness. The monitors went off. The backup generators hadn't kicked in yet. And somewhere in the dark, a nurse I never saw before or after started singing. She sang Amazing Grace, the only hymn she knew. Grace's hand tightened on the rabbit. When the lights came back on, you were here. 7 pounds 2 ounces. Except the scale had reset during the outage. So they weighed you twice, and the second reading was 7 pounds 3. Your mother said we should split the difference and call it 7.2 and the nurse laughed. That was the first sound you heard after your own crying regard a stranger laugh. If you have children, you know that the details of the day they arrived are not stored in the same place as other memories. They are stored in the body, in the hands, in the part of the chest that tightens when you hear a newborn cry in a grocery store 20 years later. No probate clause can access that filing system. No attorney can subpoena it. That is not something a judge gets to decide, I said. A thunderstorm and a nurse and a scale that couldn't make up its mind, those are yours. Nobody can take them from you, because nobody else was there. Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and set Mr. Buttons on the counter and looked at me with an expression I had not seen in her before. Not the soft steadiness of the woman I knew, but something harder. Something that had edges. I don't want to sit on the sidelines anymore. Dad, tell me what you need me to do. The attack Holbrook designed to shatter her had done the opposite. He had tried to make her doubt herself, and instead he had made her angry. I recognized the expression because I had seen it once before, on her mother's face, the morning after Lily vanished, when she told me she would not be the kind of woman who fell apart. That night, after Grace went to bed, I sat alone in my study. The bookshelves were lined with 30 years of sermon notebooks in matching brown covers, each one a year's worth of reflections and pastoral notes. I pulled the 1997 volume from the shelf. The leather spine was cracked, the pages yellow and smelling of musty vanilla. I was looking for anything I had written about Holbrook's involvement in the early days after Lily disappeared. Any detail that might confirm what the courthouse file and the Bear Creek slip had already suggested. I found it on page 43, a note I had written to myself in the weeks after the disappearance, in the small, careful handwriting of a young pastor trying to keep his thoughts organized while his world collapsed. The entry described a young legal counselor who came to the house to comfort the family. I had written the time of his arrival, 6:15 p.m. Below it, in the same ink, I had noted when I made the first phone call to report Lily missing, 7:40 p.m. 6:15 arrival. 7:40 first call. I read the entry 3 times. The timestamps were in my own handwriting. There was no version of that math that was innocent. 1 hour and 25 minutes before anyone in my family picked up a phone. He had arrived before we called. Before the church knew. Before the police knew. Before anyone on earth except my wife and I knew that our daughter was gone. The young legal counselor who comforted a grieving father was the same man who had made the father grieve. All those years I had carried his friendship like a gift. And the whole time the gift had been a leash, and he had been holding the other end since before I knew she was gone. How do you grieve a friendship that never existed? How do you mourn nearly 3 decades of trust when you discover that the trust was the weapon and the friendship was the disguise? I closed the notebook and set it on my desk, and sat in the dark for a long time. The mantel clock struck midnight. The man who had comforted me on the worst night of my life had arrived before that night began. Tomorrow I would call Boyd and Estelle and Grace. We would sit together and look at what I had found. And then we would decide whether to walk straight into Holbrook's courtroom and let him believe he was winning right up until the moment he was not. I made the calls the next morning. Boyd first, then Estelle, then Grace. By 7 that evening, all 4 of us were sitting around Estelle Mercer's dining table. For the first time in the 7 years since her husband's funeral. Estelle's table had not held more than 1 place setting in all that time, and now it held 4 glasses of sweet tea, a sheriff's folder, a sermon notebook from 1997, and the beginning of something that could not be taken back. I laid out every piece. The shell company and the money it had moved through church accounts since September. Estelle's composition notebook documenting the late-night visits. The courthouse access log with those 3 signatures. The anonymous texts on Grace's phone. The photograph of the fairground. And the sermon notebook opened to page 43, with 2 timestamps in my own handwriting that proved Holbrook had arrived at our home before anyone reported Lily missing. Boyd studied the documents spread across the mahogany, his pen scratching notes on a legal pad. Estelle sat with her arms folded, watching the way she watched everything, cataloging, filing, remembering. Grace sat beside me, her hands around a glass of sweet tea she had not tasted. Individually, Boyd said, setting down his pen. A judge throws each one of these out. The access log, he's your attorney. The financial transfers, circumstantial, without an audit. The notebook, your own notes from so long ago, uncorroborated. He paused and looked at the table the way a carpenter looks at pieces of wood that have not yet been assembled into anything. But together, they're a blueprint for fraud that spans nearly 3 decades. And his name is on every page. Nearly 3 decades is a long time to carry threads without knowing you are weaving a net. But that is what we had done. Each pulling from a different corner. Estelle from her window, Boyd from his records, Grace from her phone, and I, from a notebook I had not opened since the century turned. Now the net was spread across Estelle's dining table, and it was large enough to hold a man's entire career inside it. Then we go to the police, tonight, Estelle said. Shut it down before he reaches that courtroom. No. I said it before I had fully decided to say it, but the word came from a place that had been thinking longer than my conscious mind. If we go now, Holbrook buries the paper trail, Nola disappears, We spend the next 2 years in depositions trying to prove what we could have caught him saying out loud if we let him walk in believing he's already won. The room was quiet. Ice shifted in the tea glasses. Estelle's mantel clock marked the quarter hour. "You want to let the hearing happen," Boyd said. It was not a question. "I want to let him present his case. I want him on record, in front of witnesses, with his forged documents on the table. And while he's doing that, I want a fraud referral sitting on the DA's desk, time to arrive before the hearing ends." Boyd leaned back. "That's a narrow window. The hearing is January 6th, Epiphany. 3 days. You might think a 65-year-old pastor, a retired deputy, a church organist, and a school teacher have no business planning a legal ambush over sweet tea in a dining room that smells like lemon polish. But the people who underestimate that combination are the ones who end up inside it." Boyd would coordinate the fraud referral and secure the warrant for Holbrook's office. Estelle would retrieve the original church records before Holbrook could alter them further. She had her own key to the records room, one the parish secretary had given her years ago for filing. I would attend the hearing and let Holbrook believe I was a broken man signing away his family's future. And Grace. Grace looked at me across the table with the expression she had worn since the night before the one with edges. "You want me to sit in that courtroom and let him think I believe I'm not your daughter? I want you to sit in that courtroom and be the reason he says out loud what he's been doing in the dark." She was quiet. Boyd's pen stopped. Estelle's clock ticked. Cold night air pressed against the curtained windows. 3 days, Grace said. "I can do anything for 3 days." When she said it, I heard her mother's voice. The same voice that once told me she could survive anything as long as I was standing beside her. I had believed her mother then. Completely and without reservation. I believed Grace now the same way. Grace gripped my forearm under the table when she said it. And I felt the strength in her hand, not the grip of a frightened woman, but the grip of a woman who had chosen her ground. Holbrook had tried to make her doubt herself. Instead, he had given her a reason to fight. We left Estelle's house at 11:14 that night. Boyd's hand rested on my shoulder for a moment at the door, the weight of it saying what neither of us needed to put into words. Each of us carried a role and a deadline and no room for mistakes. 3 days until Epiphany. 3 days until Garrett Holbrook would walk into that hearing expecting to take everything I had built in 65 years and instead find himself standing inside a trap constructed by every person he had spent 3 decades underestimating. The clock had started. And for the first time since Christmas Eve, it was running in our direction. The first of the 3 days did not go according to plan. Boyd was supposed to begin the fraud referral that morning. Estelle would secure the church records, and Grace would prepare her courtroom roll. Instead, I found myself driving south on Highway 59, toward Rosenberg, because Boyd had called it Dawn with a name from the sheriff's archive. The house at the end of Cullen Road had a chain-link fence, a ceramic rooster on the porch rail, and a woman behind the screen door who looked at me like she had been expecting this visit for so long. "Mrs. Calloway," I said through the screen. "Depends on who's asking and why." I told her my name, that I was a retired pastor from Houston, and that I had a daughter who went missing from the Fort Bend County Fair in 1997. Her name had appeared in a file as a listed witness, but with no statement attached. Dorothy Calloway was 73, a retired school librarian who had lived on Cullen Road since before the highway was widened. She unlatched the screen door without a word. The house smelled like cedar and old paper and something baking. She sat me down in her living room across a coffee table with lace curtains framing flat Texas farmland through the windows. "I told that young man everything I saw," she said. Without preamble, without needing to be asked twice, the girl by the cotton candy booth, the man holding her hand, the direction they walked toward the parking lot. He wrote it all down on a yellow legal pad. Then nothing. No detective ever called, no subpoena. All those years of nothing. How many years can a lie survive inside a filing cabinet? How long can a missing page protect the man who removed it before someone drives 40 minutes down the highway and knocks on the right door? The young man who took your statement, I said. My mouth had gone dry. The sweet tea she had poured sat untouched between us. Can you describe him? Tall, late 20s, maybe 30. Dark hair, clean-shaven. Wore a suit too expensive for the fare. Said he was handling the legal side for the family, and the statement would go straight to the sheriff's office. She paused. I believed him. He had a way of making you feel like he was the most trustworthy person in the room. I knew that way. I had trusted it for nearly 3 decades. Can you describe his face more specifically? I can do better than describe him, Mrs. Calloway said. I can show you. She walked to a hallway closet. I heard cardboard scraping, something being set aside. She returned carrying a shoebox with a faded Kodak label. A shoebox. Nearly 3 decades of truth had been sitting in a shoebox on a shelf in Rosenberg, Texas, waiting for someone to ask. She lifted the lid. The smell of dust and old paper rose from inside dozens of photographs. Polaroids with yellowed borders, standard prints with dates stamped on the back. The 1997 Fort Bend County Fair. Her late husband had been a hobbyist photographer who shot rolls of film that afternoon. She sorted through them with careful fingers and stopped at a 4x6 print. My husband took this one around 3 o'clock, she said, turning it toward me. See the man by the booth left side, behind the balloon cellar. See the man by the booth left side, behind the balloon cellar. I didn't think anything of it then, but when that young lawyer came to take my statement, I remember thinking he looked familiar. I took the photograph. The edges were fragile between my fingers. The image showed the cotton candy booth, a cluster of balloon strings, families in summer clothes, and on the left side, partially behind the balloon vendor, a man, 30 years younger, thinner, no gray at the temples, but the jaw was the same. The posture, shoulders squared, chin slightly lifted. The stance of a man measuring a room, even when the room was an open field. It was Garrett Holbrook, and he was standing exactly where my daughter had last been seen alive. Is that the same man? Mrs. Calloway asked. The lawyer? I sat in that woman's living room, holding a photograph of the man I had trusted with my family's grief, standing in the exact spot where my family's grief began. And the distance between those two facts collapsed into something I could not breathe around. Yes, I said. That's him. She let me take the photograph. She asked if I wanted her to testify, and I said yes, and she said she had been waiting for someone to ask that question since 1997. I drove back toward Houston with the photograph on the passenger seat and my hands shaking on the wheel. Holbrook had not stumbled into our family's tragedy. He had been standing in the middle of it. The man who had comforted a grieving father, who had handled the paperwork and held the church key and the insurance forms for 3 decades, that man had been at the fairground the day my daughter vanished. He had buried the only witness who saw what happened. I did not go home after Rosenberg. I drove past my exit on the freeway and kept going until the shaking in my hands stopped. And by then, I was in the church parking lot on Bel Air Boulevard, without remembering how I got there. The photograph was in my coat pocket. The knowledge it carried was in my chest like a stone. I went to the church at 6 the next morning because I could not sleep. And I opened the parish ledger because I needed something concrete to look at something with numbers instead of faces. That is when I found my own signature on a withdrawal I had never authorized. $8,200, listed under charitable expenses. Dated October 2024. The authorization bore my name in handwriting so close to my own that I held it under the fluorescent light and compared it to the signature above it. One I knew I had written before I was certain. The loops on the H, the crossed T, the slight backward lean I had carried since seminary. Someone had spent hours studying the way I signed my name, learning me at the level of muscle and ink. I pulled the binder apart. September 2000, $100. November, $1,900. December 2000, $100. 3 more withdrawals, each listed as a different expense category, each bearing that practiced forgery. The total missing from the parish account was $14,300, spread across 4 entries, small enough to slide beneath the annual audit threshold. I cross-referenced the dates against the records Boyd had pulled, and every withdrawal matched a deposit into the same shell entity that had been draining the insurance fund. If someone has ever forged your name, you know it is not the money that makes you sick. It is the intimacy of it. The hours that person spent with samples of your handwriting, practicing your curves and your pressure and your spacing. Holbrook had been emptying the parish fund while sitting across from me at deacons' meetings, shaking my hand at Sunday service, calling me by my first name. He had stolen from the church the same way he had stolen from my family. Patiently, precisely, and with the confidence of a man who believed no one was paying attention. I photographed every page. Then I locked the binder in the bottom drawer of the church office desk and sat in the empty nave with a cup of bitter black coffee and waited for the day to tell me what to do next. It told me at 2:15 that afternoon, when the side door opened and Nola Vance walked in. Nola walked into that church the way a bird flies into a window. Not because she wanted to be there, but because every other direction had glass in it. She stood in the doorway, scanning the empty parking lot behind her, cigarette smoke clinging to her coat. Before she stepped inside and let the door close, "I need to talk to you," she said. "And you need to listen before you decide what to do with me." I said nothing. I sat in the pew and let her talk. She talked for 40 minutes. Holbrook had recruited her 8 months ago through a contact she would not name. He promised $50,000 and a clean start in another state. By the time she understood the full scope of what he was building, the forged documents, the guardianship petition, the manufactured identity, he had enough leverage to make sure she could not walk away. "He told me I was helping reunite a family," Nola said. Her voice was flat, the voice of someone reciting facts she had already arranged in her mind. By the time I understood what I was really doing, he had enough on me to make sure I couldn't leave. He said if I talked, I'd go to prison and he'd go home. "Why are you here now?" I asked. "Why today?" She gripped the edge of the pew. Her knuckles were white against the dark wood. "Because he has a birth certificate in his office safe. A forgery with my fingerprints on it. Because he made me handle it. If that document reaches the courtroom, it puts me in prison whether I help him or not." Her voice dropped. "The only way I survive this is if someone opens that safe before January 6th. A forged birth certificate. In a safe. On Westheimer Road. 2 days before the hearing." I looked at the woman sitting 3 pews ahead of me. Her coat pulled tight. Her eyes still watching the parking lot through the window. She was not an accomplice standing before a pastor. She was a prisoner, asking to be let out of a cell she had walked into voluntarily. Everything she had done to my family was real, and the fear on her face was real too. And both of those things were true at the same time. "I will need you to say all of this again," I said. "To a detective named Boyd Ramsey. And I will need you to say it under oath on January 6th. "I will say it to anyone you want," Nola said, "as long as I am alive on January 7th. The birth certificate was in the safe. 2 days remained. And the only way to reach it required trusting the woman Holbrook had sent to destroy me. I called Boyd from the church parking lot that evening and told him about Nola's confession and the safe on Westheimer Road. He was quiet for 10 seconds. Then he said he would make calls. I drove home and sat in the dark kitchen until my phone buzzed at 5:47 with a text from a number I had memorized decades ago. 3 words. My office, now. I drove to Westheimer Road. The building was dark except for the 3rd floor. Holbrook's receptionist was gone. The hallway smelled like cedar cologne and printer toner. the same scent I had associated with trust for 30 years. His office door was open. He was sitting behind his polished mahogany desk with a single folder in front of him, the plantation shutters casting bars of streetlight across the carpet. "Sit down. Harlan," he said. The voice was warm, the eyes were not. I sat in the leather guest chair and gripped the armrest to keep my hands steady. "You drove to Rosenberg yesterday," Holbrook said. He did not look at the folder. He did not need to. "You sat in a stranger's living room looking at photographs. You sent your deputy friend to pull records that have been sealed for 20 years. And your organist has been watching the church at hours when no one holds choir practice." He paused. "Did you think none of that would get back to me? I went looking for answers about my daughter. You went looking for a story to tell yourself. And I am here to tell you, as your attorney and as your friend of so many years, that the story you are building will hurt you far worse than it hurts me. How many times can a man call you friend in the same sentence where he describes exactly how he plans to dismantle your family? How many times do you sit still before the word stops meaning anything at all?" He opened the folder. Inside was a single printed page, a timeline. My name at the top, dates, locations, names. Every move I had made since Christmas Eve, laid out in the same clean formatting he used for court briefs. "I am not angry, Harlan. I am concerned. Grief makes people irrational. It makes them trust the wrong people and chase theories that a clear mind would dismiss in an afternoon." He closed the folder. "I have watched you build a life in this city for 30 years. I do not want to watch you tear it apart in 2 weeks." Before I tell you what he said next, before I reveal the threat he had been carrying in that folder like a loaded weapon, I need to ask, are you still with me? Comment whether you think Holbrook is bluffing, or if he truly has the power to do what comes next. And tell me why. A quick note, the next part includes some fictionalized details to deepen the emotional impact. What matters is the lesson behind it. Holbrook leaned forward. The warmth left his voice the way heat leaves a room when someone opens a door to winter. "I have documentation that raises questions about Grace's legal identity," he said. "Questions a probate judge would be obligated to refer to the state. Her teaching license, her bank accounts, her mortgage, all of it frozen pending administrative review." He let the words settle. "That process takes 18 months minimum. Is that what you want for your daughter?" Harlan, 18 months. He said it with the same tone he might use to quote a filing fee, not a threat, not a warning. Just a number clean and precise and devastating. "You would destroy a woman's life to protect a fraud," I said. "I would present facts to a court. What the court does with them is not my responsibility." He straightened the folder on his desk. "You have until midnight tomorrow to withdraw your opposition to the guardianship petition. After that, I file everything." I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper. Every response I wanted to give, every accusation, every piece of evidence sitting in Boyd's folder, and Estelle's notebook, and a shoebox in Rosenberg. I swallowed it, because the man across from me was not having a conversation. He was conducting a deposition, and anything I said would become ammunition. If you have ever sat across a desk from someone you trusted for decades and watched their face rearrange into something you have never seen before, something patient and precise and entirely without mercy, then you know the most dangerous moment is not when they make the threat. It is when you realize they have been planning it longer than you have been afraid of it. I stood up. The leather chair creaked behind me. I walked to the door, and before I opened it, I turned back and looked at Garrett Holbrook. Really looked. The way you look at a man when you are memorizing him for the last time. He smiled. It was the same smile he had given me at my wife's funeral. And I understood, with a clarity that felt like ice water in my chest, that he had been wearing that smile for nearly 3 decades, and I had never once seen what was behind it until now. The brass handle was cold under my palm. I opened the door and walked out without a word. My phone was vibrating in my pocket, a text from Boyd I could not answer yet. Not here. Not within earshot of the man who had just shown me exactly what he was. I answered Boyd's text in the parking garage beneath Holbrook's building. My hands were still shaking, but my voice was steady enough. I told him everything the timeline Holbrook had built tracking our movements. The threat against Grace's identity, the midnight tomorrow deadline. Boyd was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said he would be at my house at 5 in the morning. He called at 6:15 the next morning and said 4 words that changed everything. Captain wants to see it. We drove to the Harris County Sheriff's Office together. Boyd carried the evidence folder under his arm like a man delivering a verdict. Captain Russell Delaney was a 26-year career lawman with silver hair and the kind of desk that had seen enough paperwork to know the difference between a theory and a case. Boyd set the folder in front of him and opened it. Nola's sworn statement. The financial trail connecting the shell company to the parish account, the forged withdrawal signatures, the photograph from Rosenberg. Boyd laid each piece on the desk the way a mason lays bricks one on top of the other, each one carrying weight because of the one beneath it. Nearly 3 decades of financial fraud, witness tampering, and identity forgery, Boyd said. All pointing to one attorney. I need a warrant for his office safe before he cleans it out. A warrant is a strange document. It is permission from the state to open a door that someone has paid a great deal of money to keep closed. And the sound it makes when it lands on a captain's desk is the sound of a lock turning from the other side. Delaney read every page. He asked questions, sharp ones, the kind that test whether a case holds up when someone pushes back. Boyd answered each one without reaching for notes. When Delaney finished, he picked up his pen. On the morning of the hearing. Boyd. Not a minute before. I want him walking into that courtroom confident. The captain's signature scratched across the warrant form under the fluorescent light, and for the first time in 12 days, the law was on our side of the desk. Boyd handed me the warrant as we walked out. The paper was still warm from the printer. I held it the way you hold something fragile and irreplaceable. Because that is what it was. The hearing was tomorrow. One piece remained. That afternoon I stood at the back of Shepherd's Way Fellowship and watched my daughter walk through the side door. Boyd sat in his unmarked car in the parking lot. The visible through the window, Nola was already inside, sitting in a pew near the front, her fingers fidgeting against the hymnal rack. The late afternoon sun pushed colored light through the stained glass panels onto the nave floor between them. Grace stopped 6 pews back, the space between them filled with candle wax and old wood, and the faint cigarette smoke clinging to Nola's coat. You came into my father's house and told him you were his dead daughter, Grace said. Her voice echoed in the empty church. Do you understand what that did to him? I stood at the back and watched my daughter sit across from the woman who had pretended to be my other daughter. And I understood that fatherhood is not a single act of protection. It is watching your child choose courage when you have given her every reason to choose anger. Nola did not look away. I understand exactly what it did to him because I watched his face when he believed it. And that is the moment I knew I was not working for a good man. But by then the door had already closed behind me. What door? Nola told her. She told Grace what she had told me. The recruitment, the coaching, the threats. She described how Holbrook had built the identity piece by piece. How he had rehearsed her on details only the real Lily would know. Details he had gathered across decades of access to our family's records. She described the moment she realized the scope of what she was inside, and the moment she understood she could not leave. Grace listened without interrupting. Her hands were folded in her lap the way she folded them when she was deciding something. I knew that posture. Her mother had the same one. The birth certificate is in the bottom drawer of his office safe, Nola said. If it reaches the courtroom tomorrow, it puts me in prison and it gives him everything he wants. The warrant your detective has, that is the only thing standing between that document and a judge's hands. Grace was quiet for a long time. The colored light from the stained glass moved slowly across the floor as the sun shifted. If you have ever watched two people who should be enemies decide to trust each other, not because the evidence supports it, but because the alternative is letting the man who hurt them both win, then you know that forgiveness is not always soft. Sometimes it is the hardest weapon in the room. Then we open it tomorrow, Grace said. Together. She reached across the pew and took Nola's hand. Nola held on the way a drowning person holds a rope, with both hands, and no pride left. The warrant was signed, the safe location was confirmed. The hearing was tomorrow. Every piece was in place. And the only thing standing between us and the end of a decades-long fraud was one night. One night for nothing to go wrong. Something did go wrong that night, but not the thing we expected. Nola called at 9 o'clock to say a car had been parked outside her motel for 2 hours. Boyd sent a deputy to sit in the lot until morning and moved Nola to a room at the back. The car left at 10. We never found out who it was, but it reminded every one of us that the man we were trying to trap had spent 3 decades staying ahead of people smarter than us. Have you ever counted the pieces of your life and laid them on a table to see if they add up to enough to save everything or enough to lose it all? By 11 that night, all 5 of us were around Estelle's dining table for the second time in 3 days. The evidence was spread across the lace-covered mahogany like a mosaic, the fairground photograph from Rosenberg. Estelle's surveillance logs, the financial trail connecting the shell entity to the parish account. The forged withdrawal pages, Nola's sworn statement, and the sermon notebook open to the page with the timestamps. Boyd had drawn a courtroom timeline on a legal pad, minute by minute, and he walked us through it with his pen tapping each entry. Warrant executes at 8 a.m., he said. Hearing starts at 9. By the time Holbrook stands up to present his forged birth certificate, the original will already be in evidence custody, and his safe will be empty. And if he doesn't bring the certificate? Grace asked. If he changes his plan, then Nola testifies. The financial records speak for themselves, and he goes down for fraud instead of forgery. Either way, he doesn't walk out of that courtroom the same man who walked in. If you have ever prepared for a day that will decide the rest of your life, you know the strange calm that arrives when the preparation is finished. Not confidence exactly, but the absence of anything left to do except show up and trust the work. Estelle reviewed her role. She would arrive early at the church and secure the original baptismal records in a locked box Boyd would collect before the hearing. Grace confirmed she would sit in the gallery, as the daughter Holbrook expected to see quiet. Uncertain playing the part until the moment arrived to stop playing it. Nola would wait at the sheriff's office with a deputy until Boyd called her to the courthouse to testify. Each person held their piece. Each piece depended on every other. The fairground photograph made one last trip around the table. Nola held it longest. She studied the young man in the background, the man who had recruited her, threatened her, and promised her a life that was never his to give. And then she set it down without a word. They left one by one. Boyd first, then Nola in the deputy's car. Then Grace, who held my hand at the door for a moment before walking to her car in the cold. Estelle stood on her porch and watched us go. The way she had watched everything for years, steady, patient, missing nothing. I drove home through streets that were quiet, the way Houston is only quiet after midnight on a Monday. The house was dark. I turned on the study lamp and sat at my desk. And there it was, the unfinished Christmas sermon, sitting where I had left it 12 days ago. The sermon had been on my desk like an unanswered letter from God, started in faith, interrupted by betrayal, and now waiting to be finished in something that felt like both at the same time. I had written the opening on Christmas Eve. A meditation on the star that guided strangers toward a truth they could not yet see. I had not known then that I was writing about myself. The ink had dried mid-sentence on the night Nola appeared at my door, and the world I understood stopped being the world I lived in. I picked up the pen. The familiar weight of it settled between my fingers. I wrote about Epiphany, not the holiday, but the idea. The moment when the journey through darkness ends. Not because the darkness lifts, but because you stop being afraid to see what it has been hiding. I wrote about the distance between faith and certainty, and how the space between them is where most of us actually live. I wrote about a father and a daughter, and the years between them and the truth that had been waiting inside those years for someone to reach in and pull it out. The last line wrote itself. Epiphany is not the moment the light appears. It is the moment you stop turning away from it. The house was quiet, with the particular stillness of a house that has held too much noise, not empty, but resting, the way a battlefield rests the night before. I set the pen on the desk and closed the notebook. The mantel clock struck midnight, and the date changed to January 6th. Epiphany, somewhere across Houston. Garrett Holbrook was reviewing his forged documents, rehearsing his arguments, certain that by noon he would control everything I had built in 65 years. He did not know about the warrant. He did not know about Nola. He did not know that the man he planned to destroy had spent the last 12 days building something far more dangerous than a defense. A reckoning. Less than 9 hours remained. I slept for 3 hours that night and woke before the alarm. I showered, dressed in the dark suit I wore for funerals, and drove to Shepherd's Way with the finished sermon notebook on the passenger seat. Boyd had texted at 6 warrant team was in position on Westheimer Road. By 9 o'clock, the reckoning I had built across 12 sleepless nights would either hold or collapse. The parish hall had hosted potlucks and baptism receptions and 2 funeral wakes in 30 years. But it had never held a room that felt like this. 6 folding chairs arranged in a semicircle, a table with a microphone, and the man who had stolen my life, sitting 4 feet away with a leather portfolio, and the confidence of someone who believes the ending has already been written. Holbrook had arranged it as a church council hearing rather than a formal court proceeding. Not a courtroom with a judge and rules of evidence, but a parish hall with 3 council members he had selected himself, 2 elders I had known for decades, and the parish secretary. He had chosen this room because he controlled it. No opposing counsel, no cross-examination, no transcript unless he requested one. He was not just presenting a case. He was staging a performance in a theater he had built. If you have ever watched someone lie about your own life, not a small lie, not a misremembering, but a complete and detailed reconstruction of your history delivered with more conviction than you could muster telling the truth, then you know the particular helplessness of sitting still while your story is rewritten in front of you. Holbrook opened the portfolio with a click that echoed in the small room. He addressed the council with the warmth of a man delivering good news. "What I am presenting today is not a legal claim," he said. "It is a reunion. This woman has lived 34 years without her family, and this family has lived 34 years without their daughter. The documentation before you confirms what the heart already knows." Nola sat beside him in a navy dress he had chosen for her. Her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the table. She played her part the way she had been coached. Quiet, emotional at the right moments, letting Holbrook narrate her existence into something that sounded like truth. The fabricated dental records came first. Then a timeline of Lily's supposed return shelters, state records, a private investigator Holbrook claimed to have hired. Each document placed in a plastic sleeve and laid before the council with the precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment for months. Grace sat in the last row with her hands folded the way I had seen her fold them the night before deciding something. Holding it, she looked exactly like the confused and uncertain daughter Holbrook expected to see. She was performing, and she was performing flawlessly. Holbrook built his case the way a carpenter builds a house, foundation first, then walls, then roof. Watching him work, I understood that the house he was building was meant to stand on top of mine. And the only way to bring it down was to let him finish the roof before pulling the foundation out from under it. He was brilliant. I will give him that. Every pause was measured, every document placed at the exact moment it would carry the most weight. He referenced my late wife by name, her maiden name, the name of the hospital where Grace was born, the date of the prayer service we held after Lily disappeared. He knew details that only someone with 3 decades of access to my family's records could know. And he used each one like a key. Unlocked the council's sympathy one door at a time. The forged birth certificate came last. He lifted it from the portfolio and held it up, a single page in a plastic sleeve. The document Nola had told me about 2 days ago. The document that was supposed to be in his office safe on Westheimer Road. The document that, at this very moment, Boyd's warrant team was either seizing or had already seized. I kept my face still. I drank the bitter parish coffee. I tasted the chalky residue of the antacid I had taken in the parking lot. I gave him nothing. Holbrook set the birth certificate on the table in front of the council. Then he turned to me. "Pastor Prescott," he said, and his voice carried the same warmth he had used at my wife's funeral, the same tone he had used in my living room on Christmas Eve, the same practiced compassion that had kept me trusting him for nearly 3 decades. "As the head of this family, I am asking you to review and sign an acknowledgement of identity. This is not a legal document. It is simply a father recognizing his daughter. A signature. After everything, the stolen funds, the suppressed witness, the forged withdrawals, the photograph at the fairground, the threats against Grace, all he needed to complete his scheme was my name, written willingly on a single piece of paper. In a scheme that had been running longer than my daughter had been alive." He slid the acknowledgement form across the table. The room went silent. The council members watched. Grace held her breath in the back row. Nola sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the floor. The pen was on the table between us, and somewhere outside this room. Boyd's team was already inside the office on Westheimer Road, but Holbrook did not know that yet, and I needed him not to know for exactly 4 more minutes. I picked up the pen. I held it the way you hold something you have no intention of using, balanced between 2 fingers, resting on nothing. Holbrook watched me with the patient smile of a man who had already counted his winnings. And then the door at the back of the parish hall opened, and cold January air rushed in. And Boyd Ramsey walked in wearing his badge. 2 deputies followed him. Boyd carried a clear evidence bag in his left hand and a folded document in his right. His boots sounded on the linoleum like a clock counting down. Holbrook turned in his chair. The smile did not leave his face immediately. It stayed for 2 more seconds, the way a light stays on after the switch is flipped, before the current dies. "I'm Deputy Boyd Ramsey, Harris County Sheriff's Office," Boyd said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. At 8 o'clock this morning, a search warrant was executed at the law office of Garrett Holbrook on Westheimer Road. This evidence bag contains a forged birth certificate recovered from the bottom drawer of his office safe. Boyd set the bag on the table next to the document Holbrook had presented minutes earlier. Through the clear plastic, the pages were nearly identical. The same name, the same date, the same state seal, 2 copies of the same lie. The document currently on this table, Boyd continued, matches the forgery template recovered from Mr. Holbrook's personal safe. "Mr. Holbrook, I would advise you to remain seated. I have watched a man's face change many times in my years as a pastor. Grief, joy, shame, relief. But I had never seen what I saw on Garrett Holbrook's face when he turned to look at Nola. It was the expression of a man who realizes that the weapon he built has just been pointed back at him, and the safety is off. "This is an outrage," Holbrook said. His voice was still controlled, but the warmth was gone. "This hearing is a private church matter. You have no jurisdiction here." "The hearing is private," Boyd said. "The fraud investigation is not." Holbrook's hands were flat on the table. His eyes moved from Boyd to the evidence bag to Nola and back. The council members sat frozen. 3 people who had walked into this room expecting a family reunion, and were now watching the architecture of a decades-long scheme being dismantled in front of them. Then Nola stood up. She rose from the chair beside Holbrook and gripped the back of the chair in front of her to steady herself. Her hands were trembling. Her voice shook on the first 3 words, and then it did not shake anymore. You need to understand something about courage. It does not look the way it looks in movies. It looks like a 34-year-old woman standing on unsteady legs in a room full of people who believed she was someone else. Choosing to tell them who she really is. Knowing the truth will cost her everything except the one thing that matters. My name is not Lily Prescott, Nola said. My name is Nola Vance. I am 34 years old. I was born in Beaumont, Texas. And I have never met this man's daughter. Everything I told this family was written for me by Garrett Holbrook. She turned to face the council directly. Her voice filled the parish hall the way a voice fills a space when it has been holding something too long and finally lets go. He recruited me 8 months ago. He coached me on childhood details, the stuffed rabbit, the park, the songs her mother sang. He used baptismal records from this church that he accessed with a key this congregation trusted him to hold. He promised me $50,000 and a new start. And when I hesitated, he made sure my fingerprints were on every forged document so that if I ever told the truth, I would go to prison, and he would walk away. She's lying, Holbrook said. He was standing now. This woman is emotionally unstable. I've documented her history of... He told me to say that too, Nola said. She did not look at him. She looked at the council. He told me exactly what to say if I was ever caught. And the first thing on the list was to call myself unstable. Ask him what's on page 3 of the script he gave me. She paused. Because I brought my copy. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out 3 folded pages, creased from weeks of being carried. The edges soft from handling. She unfolded them and set them on the table next to the forged birth certificate, next to the evidence bag, next to the unsigned acknowledgement form I had never intended to sign. 3 documents on a table. A forgery, its twin from a safe, and the script that connected them all, written by the same hand, all pointing to the same man. Holbrook stared at the pages. His mouth opened and closed. The parish secretary's pen had stopped moving. The 2 elders sat motionless. Grace had not moved from the back row. Boyd stood with his hand resting near his badge. Nobody spoke. The silence that filled that room was not the silence of an empty space. It was the silence of a room full of people who had just watched 27 years of fraud collapse in less than 4 minutes, and none of them had found the first word yet. I set the pen down on the table. I would not be needing it. The silence lasted 7 seconds. Then Garrett Holbrook reached for his briefcase. His fingers closed around the handle and he pushed back his chair. Already calculating the distance to the door, already planning the next room, the next conversation, the next version of events he could control. He had been doing it for 3 decades. It was reflex. I stood up and said his name. Not as I had said it at Sunday services. Not as I had said it across my kitchen table, or in his office, or at my wife's graveside. I said it the way you say a word when you intend it to be the last time you ever use it. Garrett. He stopped. His hand was still on the briefcase. The 2 deputies shifted near the door. Boyd watched from the side of the room. The council members sat frozen in their folding chairs. And for the first time in 27 years, Garrett Holbrook was not the one speaking. I opened the sermon notebook. The pages were brittle under my fingers. The ink faded to brown, but the handwriting was mine and the words were clear. July 19, 1997, I read. My own handwriting. A young legal counselor arrived at our home at 6:15 p.m. to comfort the family. I looked up from the page. I did not call the church until 7:40. I did not call anyone until 7:40. How did you know to come? Garrett, how did you know my daughter was gone before I did? He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. How do you sit across from a man for so many years, share meals, shake hands, pray together on Sunday mornings, and not see what he is? Not once, not even for a second, I had asked myself that question every night for 12 days. And standing in that parish hall, I finally understood the answer. You do not see it because he has spent every one of those years making sure you cannot. He studied my trust the way he studied my signature, patiently, precisely, until his version was indistinguishable from the real thing. I reached into my coat and produced the photograph. I held it up for the room to see, the cotton candy booth, the balloon seller, the families in summer clothes, and the man on the left side. The council members leaned forward. This photograph was taken at the Fort Bend County Fair at approximately 3 o'clock on the afternoon my daughter disappeared in 1997. The man in the background left side. Behind the balloon seller is you. You were 29 years old. You were there. I held up the photograph and my hand was steadier than it had been in 12 days. Steadier than it had any right to be. The shaking had stopped the moment I started speaking. The way fear stops when you finally walk into the room you've been afraid of your entire life. Holbrook's eyes locked on the image. I watched his jaw tighten. I watched his grip on the briefcase handle go white behind me. Grace drew a breath that caught and held. A woman named Dorothy Calloway saw what happened at that fair. I continued. She gave an eyewitness statement to a young lawyer who said he was handling the family's case. That statement described a girl at the booth, a man holding her hand, the direction they walked. It was detailed, it was specific, and it was removed from the official file before any detective ever saw it. I set the photograph on the table beside the notebook. The faint chemical scent of a photograph older than my daughter rose from the surface. The attorney who handled that file was you. You did not just exploit my family's tragedy. Garrett. You were standing in the middle of it when it began. The radiator clicked in the silence. The air in the room felt dense, as if too many truths had been spoken too quickly for the walls to absorb them. The parish secretary had set down her pen. The two elders stared at the photograph on the table. Boyd stood with his arms at his sides. Holbrook released the briefcase handle. He sat down slowly, not like a man who chooses to stay, but like a man whose legs no longer support the weight of what has been said about him. I have served this family for 27 years, he said, but the words had no architecture beneath them, no warmth, no measured pause, no carefully placed document to support them. They were just words, the last bricks of a structure that had already fallen. He did not deny it. That is the part that will stay with me longer than anything else. When I finished speaking, Garrett Holbrook did not deny a single word. He did not explain the notebook timestamp. He did not explain the photograph. He did not explain Mrs. Calloway's missing statement. He sat in his chair with his hands flat on the table and his eyes fixed on the image of his 29-year-old self at a fairground where a little girl vanished. And he said nothing. The man who had controlled every conversation for 27 years had finally run out of words. And in the silence where his voice used to be, the room could hear the truth for the first time. Boyd crossed the room in 4 steps, and the sound of the handcuffs coming off his belt was the loudest thing I had heard all morning. Holbrook did not move. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on the photograph, and he did not look up when Boyd stopped beside his chair. Garrett Holbrook, you are under arrest for fraud, forgery, identity theft, and obstruction of justice in connection with Harris County Case File 97-4418. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be appointed for you. The 2 deputies stepped forward. Holbrook stood slowly. Boyd guided his wrists behind his back, and the handcuffs closed, with a ratcheting sound, not the click you hear in movies, but a mechanical, deliberate sound that says, in plain language, the part of your life where you decide what happens next is over. Holbrook stood in handcuffs in the parish hall where he had served as legal counsel for nearly 3 decades. The fluorescent light caught the metal at his wrists. The council members had not moved. Estelle stood in the doorway she had slipped through minutes earlier, watching with the same still attention she had brought to everything from the beginning. There is a particular silence that follows an arrest in a sacred space. It is not shock or relief. It is a room trying to understand that the person who stood in it last Sunday as a trusted member now stands in it as a defendant. And the distance between those two identities was always shorter than anyone believed. Then Holbrook turned his head toward me. His face had hardened into something I had never seen. Not the warmth, not the practiced sympathy, but the thing that had been underneath all of it. "You think this is over?" he said, his voice low, meant only for me. "You will never know what happened to Lily. That answer dies with me. And you will spend whatever years you have left wondering the way I designed it." He wanted that to be a knife. He wanted his last act in this room to be the wound that outlasts the weapon. Holbrook's words hung in the air the way smoke hangs after a fire, visible, acrid, impossible to ignore. But smoke is not fire. And words spoken by a man in handcuffs are not the truth. They are the last exhale of a lie that has finally stopped breathing. I looked at him the way a pastor looks at a man who has confused power with meaning for so long that he no longer knows the difference. "You spent 27 years believing the worst thing you could do to me was keep the truth about Lily locked inside you," I said. My voice was the voice I had used for 30 years of sermons. Quiet, steady, carrying to every corner without effort. "But you misunderstood something. Garrett, the truth about Lily is not yours. It never was. It belongs to her. And it belongs to the investigators who will reopen her case now that you are no longer standing in the way." For half a second, the hardness in his face cracked. Behind it, I saw not remorse, not fear, but surprise. He had believed his final weapon was unbreakable. He had not considered that a man could hear those words and choose not to be destroyed by them. The deputies walked him toward the side door. Cold January air rushed in when it opened. I heard his shoes on the tile, then the car door, then nothing. The cedar cologne that had filled the room dissipated in the draft, and the parish hall smelled like itself again. Candle wax and old hymnals and the faint sweetness of communion grape. I stood at the table with the sermon notebook and the photograph and the unsigned form and Nola's script and the evidence bag from a safe that no longer held secrets. I breathed. Then I turned around. Grace was standing in the aisle between the folding chairs. Tears were running down her face and she was not wiping them away. She was looking at me the way she had looked at me when she was 6 years old, with complete trust that I would still be there when the worst was over. I had spent 12 days fighting to protect my daughter. In the end, the reward was not victory or relief or even justice. It was this. I walked toward her. She walked toward me. We met in the middle of the parish hall, in the space where Holbrook's chair had been, and I held my daughter as I had held her the night she was born. Her arms came around my shoulders and she gripped me like someone who has been afraid of losing something. Salt reached the corner of my mouth from tears I had not felt start. Outside, the patrol car pulled away. Inside, I could hear Grace breathing, and I understood that this was what Epiphany meant. Not the arrival of something new, but the recognition of something that had been there all along. We stood in that parish hall until Grace's breathing steadied, and mine did too. Then we locked the room, walked to the parking lot, and drove home in separate cars through streets that looked the same as they had that morning, but were not. The church board had asked me to fill the pulpit until they found my successor, and 6 days later, I understood why I had said yes. I stood behind the pulpit at Shepherd's Way for the Sunday service and looked out at 300 faces. What do you say to 300 people who trusted you for 30 years, when the truth is that you trusted the wrong man for just as long, and that your trust nearly cost them everything? You tell them the truth, all of it. I told them about Holbrook. I told them about the forged signatures and the money drained from the parish account across 4 withdrawals since September. I told them about Nola and the fabricated identity and the hearing on Epiphany. I told them about the photograph and the sermon notebook and the decades of blind faith that gave one man the keys to everything this congregation had built together. But I did not stop there. I told them the part that was mine. I gave Garrett Holbrook a key to this church 27 years ago, I said, and he used it to steal from you. I did not see it. That failure belongs to me. I stand here today not to explain it away, but to own it. Because a pastor who cannot tell his congregation the truth has no business standing behind this pulpit. If you have ever stood in front of people you love and told them something that makes you smaller in their eyes, not a lie, not an excuse, but the plain truth about your own failure, then you know that the silence before they respond is the longest silence in the world. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then Estelle stood up, straight-backed, certain, the way she did everything. Then the deacon's row. Then the back pews. Like a wave moving forward through the nave, Sunday light through the stained glass painted color across their faces as they rose. I stood behind the pulpit watching 300 people stand up, and I could not speak because my throat had closed around something that was not grief and was not relief, but was both of them braided together. Grace gripped my hand from the front pew. She did not let go even after the congregation sat back down. "They're standing because you told the truth. Dad," she whispered. "That's all they ever wanted." The weeks that followed were slow and unglamorous. The kind of work that never makes anyone stand up. Boyd coordinated with the DA's office. The church board appointed a forensic accountant to trace every dollar. Grace returned to her classroom. The administrative review Holbrook had threatened never reached a judge with him in custody. No one filed it, and Grace's teaching license, accounts, and mortgage stayed exactly where they belonged. Estelle reorganized the church records room from floor to ceiling, cataloging every file Holbrook had ever touched. And Nola. Forgiveness is not a door that opens once. It is a door that opens every morning. And some mornings it is heavier than others. And some mornings you open it for someone you never expected to see standing on the other side. The congregation's outreach committee arranged temporary housing through a partner organization in the 3rd Ward. Grace found a part-time position at a community literacy center that did not require the kind of background check Nola could not yet pass. I met with Nola at the church office in late January to finalize the arrangements. She looked different. Not the navy dress Holbrook had chosen, not the rehearsed posture or the careful eye contact of a woman performing a role. She wore a plain sweater and jeans and sat in the folding chair across from my desk, with her hands in her lap, and none of the polish she had carried into my living room on Christmas Eve. "You had every reason to let me go to prison," she said. "I walked into your house and lied about being your daughter. Why are you helping me?" "Because you walked into a church and told the truth about not being my daughter," I said. "That took more courage than anything Holbrook ever did. And this church was built for people who need a second beginning." She was quiet. Her handshake when she arrived had been firm and direct, not performing, not measuring. Her voice was different too, softer, unscripted. "I spent 8 months being someone else," she said. "This is the first time in years anyone has asked me who I actually am. I don't have a good answer yet, but I think that's all right." I watched Nola walk out of the church that afternoon without a script in her pocket, and without a name that was not hers. And I thought, this is what the beginning of a life looks like when it starts at 34. Quieter than you would expect, and braver than anyone will ever know. That evening, after the church was empty and the lights were off, I locked the side door with the only key that still worked because the matching copy was in an evidence bag at the sheriff's office now. I stood in the January dark and breathed the cold air and felt something close to peace for the first time in weeks. Then Boyd called. His voice was careful, the way it got when he was about to say something that required sitting down. The DA's office finished their preliminary review of Holbrook's sealed files, he said. They found something about Lily, something you need to see in person. I drove to the sheriff's office the next morning, and Boyd showed me what they had found. A sealed envelope in the back of Holbrook's filing cabinet, containing correspondence with a private investigator, dated 2003. Holbrook had tracked Lily to a women's shelter in Corpus Christi 6 years after she disappeared. Confirmed she was alive, and buried the information. He had kept my daughter missing on purpose because a found daughter meant no more insurance leverage. No more grief to exploit. No more control. She had been alive. Boyd said the investigators were following the trail now. 3 weeks later, the case moved faster than anyone expected. Once the evidence was this complete, I sat in a courtroom on the 4th floor of the Harris County Courthouse. It smelled like furniture polish and fluorescent heat, and Garrett Holbrook was already seated at the defense table when I walked in. Smaller than I remembered, the way all dangerous things look smaller once they are behind glass. He wore a gray suit, no leather portfolio, no confident posture. The man who had controlled every room he entered for 3 decades sat with his hands folded and his eyes on the table. Grace sat beside me. Boyd sat behind us. The gallery was half-full church members. A reporter from the Chronicle. Estelle in the 3rd row with her coat folded on her lap. Judge Patricia Whitfield was a veteran of 31 years on the Harris County bench. Silver-haired and precise. The kind of judge who read every page of every filing and expected the same from every attorney in her courtroom. She put on her reading glasses and opened the sentencing folder. 7 counts of fraud, 3 of forgery, 2 of obstruction of justice connected to the original missing child investigation. She read each count and its corresponding finding, and the words filled the courtroom the way water fills a glass, steadily, without drama, until the glass was full. Then she set the folder down and looked directly at Holbrook. In 31 years on this bench, I have rarely encountered a scheme of this duration, this intimacy, or this cruelty, she said. The defendant did not merely defraud his client. He embedded himself in a family's deepest grief and weaponized it for profit over the course of nearly 3 decades. The court finds no mitigating circumstances. 12 years. If someone tells you how many years your pain is worth, you will find that no number sounds right, not because the number is wrong, but because pain and numbers are different languages, and the translation always loses something. Holbrook did not look at me when the sentence was read. He did not look at anyone. The gavel came down once, a single strike that echoed in the high ceiling, and the bailiff stepped forward. Holbrook stood. He was led through the side door the way all defendants are led, and the door closed behind him. And the courtroom stirred with the rustle of people who do not know whether to feel relief or grief, and are feeling both. It's done, Harlan, Boyd said, leaning forward. It's actually done. I nodded. The wooden bench beneath my hands was polished smooth by decades of anxious palms. I pressed my fingers against it and felt the coolness and the weight and the solidity of something that would still be here tomorrow. Walking out of a courthouse after a verdict is not like walking out of a church after a service. There is no benediction, no hymn, no amen. There is only a metal detector and a revolving door and the sudden shock of open air against your face. That shock is the closest thing the law gives you to absolution. Grace linked her arm through mine as we walked down the steps. Boyd walked beside us. January sunlight hit the courthouse steps in a wide, bright band, and I stopped in the middle of it. Grace and Boyd stopped with me. I did not speak for a long moment. Traffic moved on the street below, ordinary, unremarkable, perfect. A magnolia on the courthouse grounds carried the faintest sweetness into the breeze. I breathed it in, and the breath went all the way down to a place inside my chest that had been locked since the summer of 1997. And for the first time in all those years, it opened. "Dad," Grace said. "Are you all right?" "I'm standing on the courthouse steps in the sun," I said. "My daughter is next to me." The man who hurt us is inside that building, and I am out here. I think that is as close to all right as I have been in 27 years. Boyd put his hand on my shoulder the same way he had the night this started, in the sheriff's office on Christmas Eve. This time, neither of us had anywhere else to be. We were halfway down the steps when Grace stopped walking. She turned to me with an expression I had not seen before. Not grief, not relief, but something that lived in the space between them. "Dad, I want to go to Bear Creek," she said. "I want to see the place where Lily was last seen. Not because I think we'll find anything, but because I think it's time we stopped being afraid of it." I looked at my daughter, standing in the January light with the courthouse behind her and the rest of her life in front of her. And I knew she was right. We did not drive to Bear Creek that afternoon. Grace was right that it was time. But I told her there was something I needed to do first. Something I should have done 30 years ago. She understood without my explaining. She always did. That evening, we sat at the kitchen table. The chair that had been empty for as long as Grace could remember, the one neither of us had ever sat in. Though we had never called it Lily's chair out loud, Grace pulled it out from the table and set it between us. Then she looked at me and said, "Tell me about her." I opened the locked drawer of the desk in the hallway. The click of the small brass key was louder than it should have been. Inside was a manila envelope I had not touched in years. Stored on a bed of faded lavender drawer lining, I brought it to the table and slid the photographs out. 30 years of silence. Grace had grown up knowing she had a twin sister, the way you know the weather in a city you have never visited, as a fact. Distant and abstract. Never discussed at dinner. Never mentioned on their shared birthday. "Why didn't you ever talk about her?" Grace said. "Not once in 30 years? Not on her birthday, not on mine. Why?" If you have ever kept a person's name out of your own house to protect the people still living in it, you know the cost. Not the cost to you, which is bearable, but the cost to the person whose name you erased, who becomes a silence instead of a memory, a gap instead of a girl. Because every time I looked at you, I saw the half of her that survived, I said. The words came slowly, the way words come when you are speaking them for the first time, in a language you should have learned decades ago. I was so afraid of losing you to the grief of losing her that I buried her name inside the house to keep yours safe. I know now that was wrong. I kept you whole by keeping her invisible, and that was not fair to either of you. Grace was quiet. She looked at the photographs spread across the table. 2 infant girls in a hospital bassinet, a toddler's birthday party with 2 cakes, a summer afternoon on the porch with their mother. "She held my hand in the bassinet," Grace said. 7 minutes after you were born. The nurse put you side by side and Lily reached over and took your hand. She did not let go for 20 minutes. Grace picked up the photograph. Her coffee sat untouched and cold beside her. I watched her trace her sister's face with one fingertip carefully. The way you touch something you are meeting for the first time and are afraid might disappear. Grace held the photograph of the 2 of them in matching dresses, and I watched my daughter meet her twin for the first time at 34 years old. Cross a distance no amount of time could close, and no amount of love could make painless. "This one," Grace said. "The matching dresses. I'm holding Mr. Buttons. What's she holding?" "A stuffed bear. She called it Church Bear because she took it to every service. Your mother made those dresses. You were 2 years old." Grace set the photograph down and looked at the empty chair between us. The furnace cycled on in the silence. February pressed against the kitchen windows. "Is there a memorial for her?" Grace asked. "Somewhere physical?" I told her about the small marker at Bear Creek Park. The church had placed it quietly, years ago, near the pavilion where the fair used to set up. I had visited it alone. Always alone. Usually on the anniversary, never telling anyone I was going. "I want to go there." "Dad," Grace said, "I want to go with you. Not because I think she's there, but because I think we should be there together." I think she'd want us to stop going separately. Grief carried alone is a stone. Grief shared is a bridge. That evening, at the kitchen table, with photographs spread between us and Lily's empty chair finally pulled into the conversation, Grace and I began building the bridge I should have started 30 years ago. I told her everything. The morning they were born, the 3 years they had together before the fairground, their mother's grief, and how it had shaped the quiet, careful household Grace grew up in. A house full of love, but emptied of one name, as if saying it would break something that was already broken. I told her about the investigators following the trail from Holbrook's files, and that there was reason to believe Lily had been alive at least 6 years after she disappeared. I told her I did not know what they would find, but that for the first time the search was being conducted by people with no reason to hide the answer. Grace gathered the photographs and placed them back in the envelope, all except one. The twins in matching dresses, 2 years old, each holding a stuffed animal, each smiling at someone just outside the frame. She tucked it into her jacket pocket. "Tomorrow," she said. "We go tomorrow." I nodded. There was nothing left to wait for. The fear that had kept me from that memorial with my daughter beside me was the same fear Holbrook had fed on for nearly 3 decades. I was done feeding it. We drove to Bear Creek the next morning and stood at the small stone marker near the pavilion where the fair used to set up. Grace placed the photograph of the twins against the base, and we stayed for a long time without speaking. When we left, she took my hand in the parking lot and said, "We'll come back." And I knew we would, together, the way it should have been all along. The azaleas outside Shepherd's Way bloomed the second week of April, pink and white, along the Bel Air Boulevard fence line. I stood at the vestry window, watching them the way a man watches the first green thing after a long winter. No, the season had turned, and knowing he had almost not been here to see it. I carried the sermon to the pulpit that Sunday morning. The same sermon I had started on Christmas Eve. The one interrupted when a woman knocked on the church door, and everything I thought I knew about my life changed. I had rewritten the ending. It had taken 4 months. I started this sermon on Christmas Eve. I said to the congregation. April light poured through the stained glass in full color, warmer and brighter than the pale winter light that had filled this room through the hardest weeks of my life. A woman knocked on the church door that night, and everything changed. I am standing here 4 months later to tell you that the sermon was never about Christmas. It was about Epiphany. It was about the moment the light arrives and you choose not to look away. Grace was in the front pew with the twin photograph tucked into her Bible. Nola was in the 3rd row by the window. She had been volunteering in the fellowship kitchen since February and sat in the same seat every Sunday now. Estelle was at the organ. Boyd stood at the back near the door, the way he always stood in churches, one eye on the exit and the other on the people inside. If you have stayed with this story from the beginning, from the Christmas Eve knock to this April morning, then you already know what I am about to say, because you have been living it alongside me. The people who love you most are not always the people who tell you the truth. And the courage to find that out is the only kind of faith worth having. Faith is not trust without evidence, I said. My hands rested on the worn wooden edges of the pulpit, and they were steady. Faith is the courage to ask the hardest questions of the people you trust most, and to love them enough to demand the truth, even when the truth dismantles everything you built together. The congregation was quiet. 300 faces looking up at a man who had stood behind this pulpit for 30 years and was only now saying the truest thing he had ever found. After the service, they filed out into the spring sunlight. I stood at the door the way I always did, shaking hands, accepting the small kindnesses people offer a pastor on Sunday mornings. Nola passed through and squeezed my hand without a word. She did not need to say anything. The woman who had walked into this church as a lie was walking out of it as herself, and that was a kind of resurrection I had preached about for 30 years, but never witnessed until now. Estelle played the postlude Something Old, something she had chosen herself. Something that filled the nave with a sound so familiar it felt like the church breathing. The congregation's footsteps faded on the tile. The fellowship hall door closed. The building settled into the particular silence of a church after its people have gone. Then the bells rang. The same bells that had rung on Christmas Eve. The same tower, the same pitch. The same rhythm carrying across Bel Air Boulevard into the Houston morning. But I heard them differently now. A church bell does not know what it is saying. It only knows how to ring. The meaning belongs to the person standing below it, changed by everything that has happened since the last time they heard that sound. On Christmas Eve, those bells had been calling me towards something I could not see. On this April morning, they were telling me I had arrived. Not at the end. There is no end to a story about a missing child. Not really. Not ever. The investigators were still following the trail. The questions about Lily were still open. Some answers take longer than a sermon, and some take longer than a life. But I had arrived at the place where the man telling the story could finally set it down and trust that the people who heard it would carry it forward. I closed the church door and stood on the steps in the April sun. Grace was waiting for me the way she always waited, patiently, steady, certain I would come. "That was the best sermon you've ever given," she said. "And it only took you 4 months to finish it." "Some sermons take longer than others," I said. "The ones that matter always do." The bells rang above us. The azaleas bloomed along the fence. Birdsong drifted from the bushes in the warm air. And somewhere in Houston, in a life that was just beginning, Nola Vance was walking home under her own name. I took my daughter's arm, and we walked toward the car. I did not look back. Not because the church behind me did not matter, but because everything that mattered was walking beside me. And to you listening to my story, remember this. I trusted a man for nearly 3 decades because he wore the right smile and said the right words. I let comfort replace caution, and it nearly cost me my daughter, my church, and everything I had built. Do not make my mistake. Do not let the length of a relationship become a substitute for the truth of it. The people who love you should welcome your questions, not punish you for asking them. I believe God walked beside me through every one of those 12 days, not shielding me from the pain, but giving me the clarity to see through it. This was never a revenge story about tearing a man down. It was a revenge story about standing back up. The real lesson is not that bad people exist. It is that good people, ordinary people, can find the courage to stop them when they refuse to look away. Some call it a revenge story, when someone fights back against injustice. I call it a reckoning, and the difference is that a reckoning does not require hatred, only truth. If this story moved you, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Tell me, what would you have done on that Christmas Eve? Would you have let her in? Share this with someone who needs to hear it today, and if you have not already, please subscribe so we can keep sharing stories that matter. Thank you for staying until the very end. Your time and your attention mean more to me than I can say. Please remember that certain details in this story have been fictionalized for narrative purposes. Any resemblance to real individuals or events is coincidental. The message, the lesson about trust, courage,